Today we're talking about the third album, When the Storm Comes Down. In this episode, the band will be changing their label, using a new producer, and releasing an album that received criticism for its production, but also helped create a new genre that would be very prevalent throughout the 90s. I'm going to start the story about them moving to a new label. It goes as follows. After building a massive underground following with their first two albums on Metal Blade and Elektra, the band signed with MCA in 1989 in an attempt to leap into the metal mainstream. But a new label meant a new sound and different kind of production, so let's discuss. MCA Records was highly successful in R&B, but lacked a strong metal roster, so they signed Flotsam and Jetsam to anchor their new hard rock push. The album was produced by Alex Perialis at legendary locations like Electric Lady Studios. However, the final mix suffered from a dry, flat, and crude production style. The band themselves later acknowledged that the mix severely diluted the raw energy and impact of their songs, halting the mainstream momentum they expected. While they were tracking the historic 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake struck the Bay Area, heavily disrupting the band's focus and the studio schedule. Fans and critics widely panned the guitar tone for being completely devoid of that crunch instead of the thick, biting wall of sound typical of late 80s thrash. The guitars sounded dry, distant, and thin. The drum mix is frequently cited as one of the most frustrating elements. The snare drum had an abrasive, overly bright mid-range tone, while the bass kick drum was mixed with an artificial, clicky, high-end snap that lacked low-end power. But on a positive note, vocalist Eric A.K. delivered an incredibly dynamic, progressive performance, but his tracks were pushed too high in the final mix. This over-separation isolated his voice, making the music behind him sound like a weak backing track rather than a full heavy metal assault. The production can also be compared to Metallica's And Justice for All, with a lack of bass. Now this is to a lesser degree, of course, because there are some pretty cool bass parts. There's a really good bass intro with the album opener, The Master Sleeps. But throughout portions of the album, the bass guitar from Troy Gregory is difficult to hear, and that left this massive vacuum in the lower mid frequencies. The band openly voiced their disappointment with Perialis' final product, admitting that the clinical, sanitized studio environment drained the raw, aggressive energy that they possessed live. Because the songs themselves were highly complex and progressive, the flat production made the music incredibly difficult for fans to digest, ultimately earning it a reputation as a lost opportunity. The songwriting on When the Storm Comes Down marked a sharp pivot away from the straightforward, high-speed aggression of their first two albums, introducing a more technical, calculated approach to their music. The band abandoned traditional verse-chorus-verse structures in favor of a labyrinth, multi-section arrangements. Songs feature abrupt time signature shifts, complex tempo changes, and sudden, jagged rhythmic breaks. The relentless, blistering speed of tracks like Hammerhead was largely replaced. Instead, the band leaned into mid-tempo heavy grooves and syncopated thrash rhythms, mirroring the stylistic shift occurring across the broader thrash metal scene at the turn of the decade. Singer Eric A.K. drastically shifted his approach. Rather than relying on traditional metal screams and straightforward choruses, he delivered highly theatrical, unpredictable, and progressive vocal lines that frequently clashed with or danced around the intricate guitar riffs. Guitarists Michael Gilbert and Edward Carlson moved away from neoclassical solos toward more jarring, discordant lead work and experimental chord progressions. The band completely stripped away the fantasy, satanic, horror movie lyricism that defined Doomsday for the Deceiver. For this album, lyrics became deeply grounded in gritty, real-world issues. For example, Suffer the Masses tackled government corruption and societal decay, Burn Device explored religious hypocrisy, and other tracks touched on psychological turmoil and environmental destruction. Is all there is and all that's real, in a sense. When the Storm Comes Down can also be considered an early transitional precursor to groove metal. Released in May 1990, it landed precisely during that historical window when the hyperspeed of the 80s thrash was fracturing, giving way to mid-tempo, rhythm-driven groove that would dominate 90s metal. While it is broadly classified as progressive thrash, its core structural mechanics heavily laid the groundwork for the groove genre in several distinct ways. Traditional thrash relied on blistering alternate pick tempos. Flotsam and Jetsam consciously dialed back the beats per minute on this record. Instead of trying to play faster than their peers, they focused on syncopation and halftime rhythms. The shift from speed for the sake of speed to heavy, pocket-driven tempos is the defining foundational pillar of groove metal. The album's centerpiece and lead single, Suffer the Masses, is a textbook example of proto-groove. The main riff is built entirely on a swinging mid-tempo bounce rather than a rapid-fire thrash gallop. The song relies on rhythmic repetition to lock the listener into a head-banging cadence, a technique that bands like Pantera and Prong would soon turn into a science. The album's bass-heavy syncopated drive was largely propelled by bassist Troy Gregory. Immediately after finishing the tour cycle for this album, Gregory left Flotsam and Jetsam to join Prong, a band that would soon become a paramount pioneer of the 1990s groove and industrial metal explosion. The rhythmic DNA Gregory honed on when the Storm Comes Down directly bled into the birth of the definitive 90s groove movement. Because When the Storm Comes Down was caught between two worlds, still clinging to complex progressive thrash structures while experimenting with mid-tempo bouncing rhythms. It didn't become a pure groove metal album like Pantera's Cowboys from Hell, which, by the way, would be released 2 months later in July 1990. However, it undeniably captured a legendary band actively inventing the mechanics of groove metal in real time. Commercially and critically, When the Storm Comes Down performed well below high expectations set both by MCA Records and the band's core fanbase. The album failed to chart on the Billboard 200. This was seen as a major step backward, considering their previous album, released on Elektra, No Place for Disgrace, successfully cracked the chart at 143 2 years prior. But now with a different label, MCA, the album initially sold well to diehard fans upon its release in May 1990. However, poor word of mouth regarding the album's production caused retail sales to drop. The album's saving grace was the aforementioned single Suffer the Masses. That music video received heavy rotation on MTV's Headbangers Ball, keeping the band visible on the touring circuit and helping them secure high-profile live shows. The overwhelming majority of reviews focused heavily on the flat, anemic sound quality. Critics felt the sanitized mixing job stripped away the raw power and energy that defined Flotsam and Jetsam's signature thrash style. Longtime fans who fell in love with the fast, aggressive speed metal of Doomsday for the Deceiver felt alienated by the album's slower, progressive, and highly technical direction. Critics respected the band's maturity in abandoning cliché cult themes to focus on sharp political and social commentary. Because of the lackluster response, MCA Records forced a massive pivot for the band's next record, 1992's Quattro. MCE brought in a new producer to ensure the band delivered a thick, radio-friendly sound, ultimately resulting in a much more successful commercial performance than When the Storm Comes Down. That will be the next episode. I will talk about Quattro. There will be some changes. Troy Gregory's leaving the band. I'll talk about that. And this is episode 3. Check out the playlist. It should be appearing on the screen right now. And I will be doing the next episode, which will be for episode 4 for Quattro. And I will see you in the next one.